We're live.
All right. Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 7. Yes, I had it right. Episode 7 of the Sparks in the Dark podcast. And we're so glad to have you here with us. Once again, Sparks in the Dark on our podcast, we strive to open up conversations about reading and writing that will deepen our understanding of how those can be woven into the fabric of each content area, but also how reading makes us better people, how reading deepens our awareness of the world in which we live. And I'm Travis Crowder. I'm one of your co-hosts.
I'm Todd Nesloni. I'm an elementary principal in Texas, and I'm your other co-host. And we are so thrilled this week to have our guest, Dusty Bowling, who is author of Insignificant Events in the Life of a Cactus. This book right here. If you've been watching our last couple episodes, Travis and I have been just ranting and raving about this book, about how much we just really enjoyed it. And so I was like, you know what? Let's reach out to Dusty and see if she's even interested and if she'd want to come on. And she said yes without any hesitation. So we were like freaking out that we were going to get to talk to Dusty, especially right after we were talking about the book so much. So it's like perfect timing. So Dusty, thank you so much for coming on with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So Travis, you take the first question.
All right. So I want to start off by saying that this was one of those books that Todd and I happened upon because of a book recommendation. And it was such an engaging story. I have to say up front that this is becoming quickly a favorite in my classroom. And as when I finished it, I book talked it and I started passing it off to students. And I've had several of them who've already read it, and they have said, this is an amazing book. Is there anything else by this author that we can get our hands on, which we'll probably be talking with you about later in the show. But to get us started, would you mind just telling us a little bit about you, some of your background, and what led you to becoming an author?
Yeah, well, I didn't actually start writing until about 10 years ago. So I always like to tell people, it's never too late to start writing. It's never too early to start writing. But I did read a ton when I was a kid. I was a really, really voracious reader. From the time I was like in 3rd grade until middle school, I must have read 2 or 3 books a day. I was kind of going through a hard time in my life during that, and books were just my whole world. They were my escape. They were my friends. They were my family. They were my teachers. I fell in love with reading during that period in my life. And it stuck with me into adulthood. And so I tried doing some other things. I was a teacher for about 5 minutes and I worked as a project manager. You guys you guys get all the props because, it's a hard job. And I did that. And then when I stayed home with my children, when I started having children, I've always felt the need to be doing something, for myself really. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll try writing, and because I love books so much. And that was really the only reason why. Was I just remember what books made me feel like when I was that age, and to think that I could ever give that to a child, and be the author of a book that, has an impact on their life like books did for me, it's like everything to me. And I really think that's why I write middle grade, because that was the age when I fell in love with reading. And I'll never forget that period in my life. Without books, I don't know how I could have gotten through some of the times that I went through. So yeah, so I didn't know that I was going to do this, but I should have known, because of how much I always loved books so much.
Well, it's funny you talk about that, because Travis and I have very similar stories to that. And I'm sure there's so many others out there who do too. Thinking back to that time, can you think of a particular book that was really impactful to you and that meant a lot to you growing up?
Oh yeah. Well, I always think of Where the Red Fern Grows, because it was during a really sad time in my life. And it was a book that just really touched my soul. And it was also the first book that ever made me cry. So I just always fondly remember that book so much. And Island of the Blue Dolphins, and just books that carried me away as well from, you know, what was going on in my life, and, you know, anything that could take me away like that. And I read every Nancy Drew that there was, and I just loved going on her adventures with her, and the Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High and all of those books. But the book that really, I think, touched my soul during that period more than any other book was Where the Red Fern Grows. So, and yeah, I always think of that book.
You know, I love how this whole narrative here of how books have affected you, how they've influenced you as a human being and as an author. I think that's such a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that with us. I would like for you, if you don't mind, to talk with us a little bit about the genesis of the idea for Insignificant Events. This is a unique story. It's one that is unlike anything I've ever read before. The way that the characters interact, the way that the people talk, but also how the protagonist is differently abled. I would love for you maybe to talk a little bit about the genesis of this story, how it came about, what influenced you to write this particular story, because it is unique.
Absolutely. The idea, I think, was planted. So the very genesis of it, I think, took place about 10 years ago when I first started writing. And I was just trying my hand at like some picture book manuscripts and little things. I started kind of small. And it was during that time that I got a phone call about my cousin, Kyle, who was serving in the war in Iraq. And he had been severely injured, and he had lost his eye. He was going to lose his arm. He was in a coma, and they were flying him home to the United States. Unfortunately, he didn't make it to the United States because he was in such grave condition that they had to stop in Nova Scotia to give him medical care. So we just had to sit and wait to hear what was going on with him. And during that time, I thought a lot about what his life was going to be like with a missing arm. What kind of jobs would he be able to get? How would he take care of himself? Would his girlfriend still want to be with him? I was really just concerned about this whole, you know, that he was going to lose his arm. And so during that time, because I was so interested in children's books and I had just started writing, I started looking up information, doing as much research as I could. And I also found that there were no children's books featuring characters with limb differences that I could find. I mean, there have been some that have come out recently since then, but like 10 years ago, I literally could not find any. And I just couldn't believe it. I thought that was incredibly sad, because it's not that uncommon for a child to have a limb difference. Why are there no characters like that? So, but unfortunately, my cousin passed away a couple of weeks after he was injured. So I just kind of pushed that idea aside and didn't think about it again for a couple of years until I saw this video online, just like an old news video of this woman who was changing her baby's diaper and working out at the gym and folding towels and doing all these things. And she didn't have arms. It was like so eye-opening to me. She was doing everything with her feet. And I could not stop thinking about her, because before, when I had thought about like my cousin with a missing arm, I had been so devastated, and I had thought, you know, how is he even going to live his life? And here was this woman with no arms who was doing everything that you and I can do. And yeah, this is just how I live. And I do everything with my feet. And I just thought she was so amazing, you know, not amazing because she was doing mundane things, but her attitude and the way she approached life and everything. And I could not stop thinking about her. So I thought about her for a long time until Avon started developing in my mind. And then I couldn't stop thinking about Avon. And I probably thought about Avon for a couple of years before I even ever sat down to write this story. So by the time I sat down to write it, I'm sorry, I think there's an echo.
Yeah, Travis.
So by the time I did finally sit down to write it, I knew her so well. It was one of those characters or ideas that you just can never forget and will never leave you alone. And so during that time when I was writing it, I watched all of these videos because there's very little to read about life without arms. So I found this woman on YouTube who does a video series called Tisha Unarmed. And she shows how she does everything without arms. She's so funny too. And so like carving pumpkins or going bull riding or just all these things, making a sandwich, getting dressed. So I studied her videos, like that was my research. So, and then when I finished writing the book, I reached out to her and asked her if she would be willing to read my story. And she was so gracious, and she's been extremely supportive. She loves the book. And because of her, I got to meet Jessica Cox, who is an armless pilot and is also a black belt and a motivational speaker. And then this is such a wild story. But then one day I get a call from my uncle, and he's like, I saw this woman working out at the gym and she didn't have arms. And I wanted to go up and say, hey, my niece is like working on a book about a girl with no arms, but it seems so weird. And I was like, really? What did she look like? And he was like, well, she had like short, red, spiky hair and tattoos. And she was like really fierce looking. And I was like, wow, that sounds like Barbie Thomas, the armless bodybuilder. Because I had been like, researching all these people and learning about them. So I looked her up, and it turns out she lives in the city. And so I messaged her on Facebook, and I was like, were you working out at this gym in Gilbert? And she was like, I was. And I was like, oh my gosh, my uncle saw you and I know who you are. And it turns out she was the woman in the original video that I saw, that old news show that spawned the whole idea of this character in my mind. I didn't even know it was her, because she used to have like really long blonde hair, and she was like very momish, and now she's all like this fearsome, tatted up like bodybuilder. So she looks very different. So it was such an incredible revelation. So because she lives here in my city, I've gotten to meet her. She came to my book launch. She read my book. She made, make sure it was authentic. So I got to have a few reads on it, which was really fortunate, because it's not like, it's really easy to find a lot of people without arms to do sensitivity reads on it. So the fact that I was able to have 3, I think was incredibly fortunate, and they've all been wonderful and helpful. And I love them.
Another character in the book is a character with some severe Tourettes syndrome. And that I really connected with that character. My cousin grew up with Tourette's. And so I've seen some of that. And it was funny reading through it, because I some of the things that you were talking about holding them in during the day and letting them out, like those kind of things were things that she dealt with as well growing up. And our guest that we had on last week, a principal friend of ours named Brad Gustafson, he also struggles with Tourette's, and said that as he read the book, that was one thing that really was connecting with him, because you don't have a lot of children's literature, especially, that deals with that. And so where was the inspiration to have a child with Tourette's in the book as well?
So when I first started thinking of this story, so I'd been thinking about Avon for a long time, and I didn't know what her story would be though, but this scene like popped into my mind, and it was Avon sitting on the couch playing her instrument. At the time it was a keyboard. I changed it to a guitar later, for her friend who was sitting next to her on the couch crying, and her thinking that she was feeling like one of the only reasons why not having arms was a loss was because she couldn't reach over and wipe his tears away. And I just kept thinking about that scene so much. And I realized I didn't really know why the boy was crying, but at the time, my daughter, who was 11, had just started developing tics, and they were getting more and more severe. So we were going through that. And so I knew then, after a little while, that the reason why he's crying is because he has Tourette's syndrome, because he's just started dealing with this, and he's having a hard time with it, because we were dealing with a lot of tears with my own daughter who was dealing with it. So that is why I put a character with Tourette's syndrome in. My daughter her tics have continued to increase over the last few years. And the neurologist says that she probably does have Tourette's syndrome. They're not going away. My 6-year-old also has developed tics now, which is really awfully young to have tics, but she has a couple of really loud phonic tics, which is really, I think, unusual for that age. But so Connor was really inspired by my children and my husband, who grew up with tics, and he grew up in a kind of a poor family environment where he didn't get the support or the help he needed. No, he was never diagnosed as a child. He never had any support or help until he was an adult. And even then, not much, because he never really realized even that he had this tic disorder. And so luckily, as he's gotten older, his have gotten a little bit better as he's reached middle age, which can sometimes happen. But in the meantime, my theirs are increasing. So yeah, I really wanted to put a character with Tourette's syndrome in the book because there is so little out there with characters with Tourette's syndrome, and what has been put out up until now a lot of times has been really, really poor representation, especially in movies. Every time I talk to anybody about it, they're like, oh yeah, I know what Tourette's syndrome is. It's when people shout cuss words. And I blame that largely on movies. So that is something that I'd like to change, that whole perception of what Tourette's syndrome is. And so a big part of why I did the support group meeting and in there is to show the many manifestations of Tourette's syndrome and how it can be so different from child to child. And it is so incredibly different from child to child. And I also included one child who does say words because I wanted to make it clear and not confuse people that, like, yes, that form of Tourette's syndrome does exist, but it's rare. And this is a lot more common.
Well, and you know, having a family member who has Tourette's, that was really a powerful scene for me, or a part of the book is when you did show that, because I think you're exactly right. Because of a movie or two, so many people view it as yelling out curse words and you can't stop. And just to have that scene where you got to see all those different kids struggling with Tourette's at different levels, I think was a really powerful moment to say that, you know, they all have this, but it looks so different. And not only that, but then the family support in each one of those is different, because that was what I think was one of the most powerful things in the book too, was seeing him struggle with a father who left and he feels to blame for that. And then a mother who is having to work so much to try to take care of him, and he feels like he's to blame for that too. And just seeing that kid, you know, I work with a lot of kids from difficult environments, but seeing the child feel like everything is their fault, that was really powerful, the way you portrayed all of that.
Oh, thank you. I think that kids often do feel that way when there are things happening in their lives. And so, yeah, I wanted to show those feelings and then also show that it's not your fault. Yeah.
All right. So I have a question for you about, I guess it's more of an artist's question than it is anything else. But, you know, I like what you had to say about, you know, all of these characters in the book. The one, Avon, and then Connor, and then, you know, you've got this, like, you know, there's like a disparity, it's almost, between both of their experiences. Connor is the one who's trying to learn to adapt. Avon seems to be more adapted. And I want to ask you this question, which I'm just out of pure curiosity. Why was it you decided to show Avon as someone who had already come to, like, she had already developed coping mechanisms, she had already learned how to do? Why did you decide to show it at that point instead of where she was trying to deal with it? Was it just something that you had thought of, that you wanted her to already have adapted to her situation? Well, I'm just curious, because I think it was beautifully rendered what you did. It's an artist question, and I was curious.
Thank you. Well, I think I was definitely inspired by the women that I discovered who don't have arms and all that they were capable of, and their stories. And for them, not having arms never held them back from doing anything that they wanted to do. And they just lived like that. And I think that there are a lot of stories out there about children coming to terms with a disability, or like trying to, or I guess you could say, overcome their disability, which I don't really care for that statement. But so I kind of just wanted to show a disability as being a part of a full, complete, happy life. And so, because I think that most people out there with disabilities do live full lives, and it's not always just about trying to do things in spite of the disability, but, you know, learning, you know, but just living your life with the disability like you always have. And that's what I've seen with every person that I've discovered who doesn't have arms. I see them out there just living full lives, really capable, because that's what they've always known. And definitely they've had support in their families to get there. And so I did want Avon to have the support of parents. I think that there's also a lot of bad or absent parents in middle grade. And I kind of wanted to do something a little different with that and show, that there can be really fantastic parents too. So,
and I loved that portrayal of just the so much support she had from her family, and just that they never made her. When in the story it talks about the mom saying, I never wanted you to ever say that you couldn't do something. I always wanted you to believe that you were capable of anything. And I think for middle grade students to read this story, it's such a power, especially in our day and age now, with everything they're seeing on the news and everything, that there's just seems like such a lack of empathy so often, that this is such an easy story for a kid to pick up and really connect with the characters and build empathy. Just like you said, of having that family member who was like, saw him at the gym, was like, I wanted to go up and say something because of the character. For me, it was kind of like, I want to have some conversations now when I see some people, just because this intrigued me, and it was such a, I fell in love with the character so much. Why do you feel like it's so important that middle schoolers, particularly, have access to stories like this?
Oh, well, I mean, there has to be windows and mirrors books, right? It's so important. I think that when a child can't find themselves, their life reflected in a book, it's kind of like saying that they're not worth writing about. And I think that that's really damaging to a child's, I don't know, to their whole life perspective, maybe. It definitely, I think, is damaging to hopefully pulling them into the love of reading and books. If you can ever find anything that you can relate to in a book, then I just don't think that you can make that connection. So with reading, maybe completely. So I definitely feel like representation is so incredibly important. And it's so incredibly important too, like you said, for empathy, for other kids. I think that, I hope that, like, because of my portrayal of Connor and Tourettes Syndrome, and because of all the schools I've gotten to talk to and the kids, that, maybe there will be just a little bit less making fun of kids who have tics, things like that. Because tic disorders are really, really common. And 1 in 5 children develops a tic as they get older. And I wonder, how many of those kids have been made fun of for all of the funny things that they're doing, for blinking their eyes or shrugging their shoulders. And maybe if there was just a little bit more education and understanding out there about it, that could happen less, So I just hope that that's the result.
And there was one thing you mentioned that, one of my friends just messaged me who's watching, and he has cerebral palsy. And he said that one of the things that you just said that he was like, yes, was the whole, you didn't want to portray it as something they were overcoming, and that it was something that and I think that's such a thing to really make clear. This isn't something that has to be overcome. And so I think that was really powerful that you said that. When did you realize that was the case?
I realized it by getting to know these people. I don't know, like, I feel like they're not overcoming not having arms. They're like thriving as armless people. And I just realized that it just doesn't need to always be about that. And I think it's hurtful in a way to the people who have disabilities, that the stories out there are always, it's almost like the closer that the character can get to being without the disability, the happier their life can be. And I feel like that must make them feel like crap, like to always read stories like that. And so I just wanted to portray a character that was like, yeah, I don't have arms and I'm pretty awesome. So, I don't need to have arms. I don't need to get, the end of the story doesn't need to be, oh, now I have these prosthetics that make me more like an armed person, and so I can be happier or something like that. It's more about really the only challenges in Avon's life. I mean, yes, there are challenges that come with not having arms, but it's other people's perspective and reactions to her. And I think that having the literature that always portrays disabilities as something you have to overcome doesn't help with that perspective of people with disabilities. So I hope that more books come out that have people with disabilities just basically living their lives and doing cool things, you know, while being disabled. Like, I'd love to see a story about a guy with cerebral palsy who I've been watching these amazing videos of this one guy. I forget his name, but he's so hilarious. And he makes the funniest videos. I wish I could think of his name. And he has cerebral palsy. And I think he would make the best character for a story. Just doing these things that he does day to day and just like being his funny self and living his life, and you know, he could have an adventure.
I think it's just really cool something. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm very sorry. I'm having a difficult time because I'm trying to hear and then I'm trying to unmute, and sometimes my cursor decides that it wants to flip out on me. So I wanted to just sort of touch a little bit, not to belabor this point, but to talk a little bit about, or just, I guess, extend the thinking. You know, you brought up Rudine Sims Bishop's words about windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. And I think that's such an important part whenever we think about the things that we write, the things that we say, and the things that we expose children to, and the things that we want them to see. We want them to see as many reflections of the people around them themselves, but also people who are unlike them, people who have differences. I recently wrote a piece with a dear friend, and we talked about how inclusive literature is more than just literature that has people of different skin color, although that is that's very important. That's not the only type of diversity that exists in our world. And I really do love the affirming character that you created. I mean, I think that's wonderful. The thing that got me about Avon, though, was just how hilariously sarcastic she could be. Is that part you?
Yeah.
Are you?
Yeah, that's probably me. Because I have another book coming out this fall, and my main character is probably also a bit sarcastic in there. So it's probably me.
Well, I love that because she has this beautiful personality. She's blossoming into this beautiful person. And that part just added to it. I actually marked several parts in your book because I want to share them with students. I think they're gorgeous mentor texts to show students how you can wrap a moment in sarcasm and make it funny. How can you take something, this paragraph, especially when her thinking would come to the end of, and then she would tag it with this one line, and I would burst out laughing. And I thought, this is perfect. This is something that students could do in their writing. A great craft move.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I love writing humor, and so I definitely wanted Avon to be a funny character with a good sense of humor and a good attitude. So I loved writing her character. Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
So you mentioned you've got a book coming out this fall.
Yeah.
So I'm interested if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's a very different story from my first book. It's called 24 Hours in Nowhere, and it is actually an adventure story about 4 kids who live in this really, really poor desert town called Nowhere. And they make the decision one night to go into this dangerous abandoned gold mine to try to find a piece of gold to buy back a dirt bike that a girl traded to this bully to save the main character from his torment, basically. And the most important race of the summer is the next day. And the girl and the bully are like the 2 best racers in the town, and there's a pretty cool prize at stake, which has never happened before. So again, I think it's a Windows and Mirrors book. It's a diverse cast, all fairly poor children living in this town that is much like many desert towns that I'm familiar with, and much like one that my husband grew up in, who grew up very, very poor. And so that was another area that I feel like maybe there's not enough of is disadvantaged children. Usually if you do have a story about a disadvantaged child, it's awfully sad. And so I'm not that that's not sad, and but I feel like children can still have a lot of fun and joy in their lives, even when they don't have money and things. And so I wanted to take these kids out of their lives and basically throw them into this adventure where they kind of self-discovery, and it takes place over only 24 hours. So they make a lot of self-discovery only a day. So it's, so, hopefully everyone will like it. So
and when does it come out?
It comes out on September 4th.
Exciting.
Yeah. So, and there's some ARCs floating around out there. So if you can get your hands on one, then you can read it now.
Oh my goodness, it'd be like gold. It'd be like gold. I would love to get my hands on one. So I'm going to go back and touch on something. Todd and I often talk about our writing processes are a lot different. Mine and Todd's are. I know whenever Todd and I, whenever we were writing our book together, I would often tell Todd would tell me, would you please put stuff inside of the document? Would you please put stuff inside there? And I would say, well, I'm writing it. I promise. I'm just putting it in my notebook. And so what I would do is I would sometimes just lay my notebook open and I would snap pictures of it and I would send it to him. And I was like, read this and tell me what it says. And he'd say, I can hardly see that, but it looks like it's great. Will you please put it in the document? I'm like, I will. I'm just not done. So I tell you that to ask, do you keep a writing notebook yourself? Do you have something that you write in, or do you do things digitally?
Not really. I mean, every now and then I'll handwrite something in I usually have like a spiral notebook or something I carry for notes or grocery lists and stuff. And if I have something that I really, I don't want to forget, I'll write it down. But honestly, I do most of mine just typing in my computer, and I have hundreds of probably documents with like ideas and things. So they're all on my computer backed up. So, but I know this sounds so silly, but like my hand cramps up really fast when I handwrite things.
Me too. See, I totally get you. I totally get you, Dusty. We're on the same page here. See, Travis, I'm not the only one.
Yeah, it would take me forever to handwrite anything, and I'd have to stop and be like, "Oh, massage my hand," like every minute. So now
I want to talk a little bit about you growing up, Dusty, as a kid in school. Travis and I talk a lot, especially to educators now, about building that love of writing or reading into our kids.
And reading.
Yes. And when you, Dusty, were growing up, you talked about how reading was an escape for you. But in school, did you feel like you had an education where reading and writing was really celebrated, or was it built into you by a teacher, or just something you happened across and it really became important to you?
Yeah, I don't know that it was really the result of school. I don't recall it ever being celebrated, at least not to the level that it should have been. I think that it was definitely just something that was me. As a matter of fact, I used to get in trouble for reading in class all the time. So, because I would be like during math with a book under my desk reading. It was like an obsession with me. So no, I don't think that it was the result of that. And I don't recall ever having a teacher who really pushed reading. But I hope that is not the case everywhere. So I do see teachers, passionate teachers on Twitter, online, everywhere I go for my school visits, who are passionately trying to push reading, just encouraging children to read whatever it is that they enjoy. And I think that there are some things that make it hard, like the AR thing makes it really, really hard. The accelerated reader program. Yeah. I know that like for me, for the first few months that my book was out, I had several people tell me that their kids couldn't read my book because they couldn't get their AR points for it. And I just thought that was so sad because of the books that they'd be missing out on. And then they have to read books that maybe they're not as interested in. And then the whole thing, I think, is a little detrimental to a child's love of reading. But then I see teachers trying to work in spite of it and still encourage all kinds of books and everything. And I see how much they care. And I think there are a lot of really awesome teachers out there doing that. But it can be hard in the current environment that, you know, there's a lot of pressure to get credit for your reading, and with testing and everything. I'm sure
you're fixing to set Travis off here with this accelerator reader thing, because we're both on the same page with this thing. But I know Travis, he'll go on a tirade if we're not careful about this.
I know a lot of people who would go on.
Because I mean, it's just, I'm sorry, just give me just a moment, all right? Because I gotta get I'm going to combust right now. You know, it's a shame that we live in a time when people are more concerned about points than they are about getting lost in a wonderful story. And if there's ever an argument against AR, I feel like you've given a wonderful one. Here's this great book that I have written that people will benefit from reading, but there are students who can't because it's not on their level. It won't give them enough points. They won't get enough to get the A for the grading period or for the year. And that's a shame. That's a shame because, you know, reading is, you know, I believe students should challenge themselves as readers. We do several things over the course of the year to get them to think about, you know, what are you reading? How much are you reading? But, you know, it all goes back to choice in my classroom. And if they want to read a book that is not at their level, whatever that even really means, then that's okay, because that's a book and it has words in it and you can read it. And it's a great one too.
Yeah.
All right, I'm done.
And Dusty, I want to know, Dusty, and I'm so happy that you brought that up without us having to say anything about that, because that totally wasn't led by us, but I know we're in total agreement because
they did not plant that.
Thank you. Not.
So I want to know, are there any writers that are out there that really inspire you right now, or that you've been really impressed by their work and it's kind of influenced some of your own?
Yeah, I mean, since I've started this whole adventure, I've met so many amazing writers. Every one of my fellow middle grade debuts from last year, the 2017, we sort of have our own little online group, and I'm so inspired by all of them, really. Just each one's journey is so different, and everyone's just trying so hard, and everyone just loves books and wants to reach out to children. And so just so many of them. And then some of my favorite authors have been really inspirational to me just in my writing and everything, like Catherine Applegate. I just love her books so much. And if I could ever, be even close to that level, I would be so thrilled. And then another debut I wanted to shout out, Ellie Terry. She, her book, Forget Me Not, it's about a girl with Tourettes Syndrome. And Ellie Terry herself has Tourette's syndrome. So it's a really, really great own voices book about a girl with Tourette's syndrome. And I think it's a really wonderful portrayal. And of course it is, because she would know, because she has it. And I really enjoyed watching her journey, because her book has been so well received by children, and she didn't get like a ton of buzz or promotion or marketing, but just because of how beautiful the book is, it's just spreading, and you see kids loving it. And, it was on all these mock Newbery lists and everything. And I was just so happy to see that. And I think it can do a lot of good for.
And it was mentioned last week by our guest on last week. So it's so funny you bring that up, because that was the key book talk last week. So that's awesome.
Yeah. So that's definitely always at the top of my mind, that book. And I'm so happy for her. And I'm so happy that that book is in the world.
That is so amazing. I love that you shared that. So we're going to wrap up, and we're going to ask you, though, before we go, to leave us with a book recommendation. And if there's more than one that's floating around in your mind, don't hesitate to give two. Or, another one if you think you want to leave us with those. But we would love to hear. And I'm saying that because I love book recommendations. Todd's rolling his eyes. His inner eye is rolling so hard at me right now. But I love hearing, because I read them and then I take them to school and I book talk them. So leave us with a book recommendation or three.
Or three. Oh, no pressure. So of course, I have to recommend Ellie Terry's Forget Me Not. I want as many kids as possible to read that book, and mine, and then they'll have a pretty good understanding of Tourette's Syndrome. And just some other books that I really loved. I try to make a point to read as many of my other fellow debut authors as possible, but Supriya Kelkar's Ahimsa was really, really lovely and taught me so much about a period that I had really very, very little knowledge about. And so I really highly recommend that one. Paul Mosier's Train I Ride is a really great book. I was kind of hoping for a Newbery honor for him, but alas, no. Just it's kind of a sad one, but some kids need that, I think. And Sally Plaw's The Someday Birds. And I actually saw that you just recommend Stanley Will Probably Be Fine. I haven't actually.
Oh, have you read that?
No, I haven't yet, but I've read The Someday Birds, and it's very lovely.
Sally is one of the sweetest ladies ever.
Yeah.
She also endorsed my book, Stories from Web, that I just came out with. But when I read Stanley Will Probably Be Fine, I read it right after yours, and I was like, these books are just a perfect complement of each other, of all the different kids that we have out there and how they interact with the world. So yeah, I love these recommendations at the end, because those other ones I haven't heard of yet. And so for me, it's like, oh, good. There goes more in my Amazon cart. But
well, good. I'm glad. Yeah, there have been so many good books that came out in the last year. It's hard to, sometimes I feel overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to read all these books? So many have been so beautiful. Yeah.
Well, Dusty, thank you so much. I mean, Travis and I both absolutely love this book. For our listeners and watchers, if you haven't read Insignificant Events in the Life of a Cactus by Dusty Bowling, you should pick it up today. And I promise you, if you're anything like me or Travis, you will read it in 1 or 2 sittings, because you just won't be able to put it down. But the characters were beautiful. The story was just a great, uplifting, but heart-wrenching portrayal at the same time. So I'm so glad that we were able to have you on as a guest. And I want to thank you for what you're putting out into the world. I know that Travis and I can't wait to check out the next books that you're going to put out. But thank you for writing about kids with all kinds of abilities and backgrounds, because our students need those stories, and as educators we need to be introducing those stories to our kids. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dusty, for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, and thank you guys for recommending our books to children. That's everything to us. I was really happy to be here tonight.
Thank you. And we'll see everybody for our next episode in a couple days. So thank you so much for listening and watching. Remember to always share out your latest book recommendations on social media using the hashtag #SparksInTheDark. We'll see everybody later.